Okay, Josh, what do you reckon? Should we kick off?
Yeah, I think let's kick off, Phoebe.
Fabulous. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It's great to see so many of you on the line. Welcome to this session with the Chancery Lane project, The Power of Climate Clauses, Open Source Tools for Built Environment Contracts. I'm joining you not from the Great Barrier Reef, as my background might suggest, but from Melbourne, Australia. So it's really important that I begin this session with acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded land where I'm joining you from today, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge the long and uninterrupted connection to country and vital role of Indigenous knowledge in solving for the climate crisis. I'll also start by letting you know that we are recording today's session, so there is no need to take any notes as you go. And that I'm Phoebe Roberts, and I'm the co-lead of the APAC region and also the Built Environment lead at the Chancery Lane project. I'm also a senior associate in Minter Allison's climate risk governance team, and my background is in the procurement of major projects, infrastructure and construction projects, both in Australia and in the UK. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Josh.
Thanks, Phoebe. Hi, everyone. I'm Josh. I'm a project associate at TCLP. I've got a background in commercial law, and as part of that, I spent some time in-house at an oil and gas major. I'm currently supporting Phoebe with our Built Environment project at TCLP. We're lucky to be joined by some fantastic guest speakers today who have kindly given up their time to be here. We've got Kirsty Draper from global real estate services provider JLL, Phoebe Considine from law firm Arthur Cox, and Sinead Cunahan from law firm Mason Hayes and Curran. We've got our TCLP colleague Humzah, who leads our work adapting climate clauses for new jurisdictions in Europe and around the world. And we have Claire Heron from Loudus Foundation. The built environment is a priority field for Loudus, and Claire has kindly offered to open today's session with a few words. So I'll pass over to you, Claire, if you're with us.
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Brilliant. Yes, thank you, Claire.
And you can see me. Great. Okay, well, I'm not going to take up a lot of time. I'm delighted to be here. We're great supporters of Chancery Lane, and they do fantastic work. And I'm so delighted to see so many people attending here. Built environment, as Josh said, is quite a big priority for us. We fund across a whole range of work that's looking at how we decarbonise buildings, and particularly how we tackle the difficult problem of embodied carbon in our buildings as we really drive towards net zero. So we fund a lot of interesting work that looks at how the built environment can be decarbonised, and we work a lot with the finance sector on how that whole transformation can be funded. I suppose we see law as the golden thread through all of that. It's absolutely vital that we get the clauses right, that we get the mindsets right, and that we get the profession really behind the move to net zero. That's going to have to happen pretty quickly now. So I'll leave it there. I think this is a fantastic session. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you get something useful.
Thank you very much, Claire. Anyone can read more about Loudus and their amazing work funding projects like TCLP all over the world, and especially in the built environment, on their website. So we're lucky enough to have up to an hour with you today, and the aim of this session is to introduce you to our work in decarbonising the built environment, spotlight the free resources available to help you on this journey, and to inspire you to get involved with expanding the project across Europe in particular. So I'll start off by introducing TCLP and what we do. I'll give a quick overview of our built environment project, which has been going on all year, and we've been really enjoying that. Next up, Kirsty Draper, a sustainability lead for the UK agency at JLL, will offer her perspective and insight into what JLL are doing across Europe. We'll then run you through the free built environment resources available to you and a case study on a public body using TCLP clauses in its contracts today. Humzah will introduce you to our Transpositions project, which is an opportunity for you to bring TCLP clauses back home and to life in your jurisdictions. And then Dervla and Sinead will share lessons learned from a successful Transpositions project, which is hugely exciting, adapting TCLP clauses for use in a new jurisdiction. At the end, we'll outline a suggested action plan for you, and then we'll have some time for questions. I hope that all sounds good. So the Chancery Lane project, or TCLP for short, is a non-profit collaboration of legal and industry professionals spanning almost all sectors and practice areas. As you all know, legal contracts govern the way business is done. Right now, everyone in this session, along with our networks and our supply chains, will be bound by certain obligations under certain contracts. and performance of those obligations will likely be producing greenhouse gas emissions in one way or another. Established contract models aren't necessarily suitable for delivering sustainable, innovative built environment projects. And at TCLP, our aim is to rewire those contracts so they actually reduce the emissions produced by business. And to achieve this, our community of over 2,600 lawyers and legal professionals, as well as industry experts from more than 330 organisations, have donated their time to draft ambitious template contract clauses. Now, these still perform commercially, but they also deliver on climate goals. I'm sure we can all imagine what the invoice for those thousands of lawyer and consultant hours would add up to, but their output's free for you to take from our website anywhere in the world to adapt and start using in your contracts today. And there's no commitment wall or registration required. You can start using our stuff today, however you like. We currently have 119 clauses that we're very proud of, a glossary of over 50 climate-related terms, and a net zero toolkit to educate and upskill yourselves and your colleagues. Our clauses are ambitious and they don't mirror current market standards in many sectors around the world. So some are easier for lawyers to integrate than others, but they do reflect what contracts will need to look like in the near future if parties are going to realistically hit their climate and sustainability targets. So the first question you might ask is, why do we use contracts to fight climate change? One of the best legal solutions to a lot of climate issues is, of course, legislation. And at TCLP, we take the view that legislation, though it's very powerful in the long run, is often too slow to adapt to meet ambitious net zero targets quickly enough and to avoid the catastrophic futures laid out in recent IPCC reports. The contracts, on the other hand, well, they're bespoke and they're relatively nimble documents which can be changed quickly, implemented quickly, and enforced using the normal means of contractual enforcement. You can start to deliver your net zero ambitions immediately through your contracts. And we all appreciate in the built environment sector the influence of precedent contracts like FIDIC on construction and infrastructure professionals, and how these are typically amended, tweaked, and made fit for purpose by their users in the context of particular projects. We just need to start applying that existing framework to climate-related targets, and we have a package that's ready to go in the built environment sector. Now, we strongly believe that built environment lawyers and other professional advisors have the power to combat the climate crisis through what you do every day. There's no need to retrain. You already have the skills and the experience. You just need the enthusiasm to advocate for change through contracts. And that's where we come in. So TCLP has received funding from Loudest Foundation for a special ambitious project in 2022 and hopefully beyond, aimed at decarbonising the built environment. And when we talk about the built environment, we mean both the real estate industry, that includes property management, transactions and leasing, and more, and the construction side, including project financing and design, on-site working practices, and materials supply, among other topics. In brief, our built environment project goals are to identify key intervention points where targeted climate drafting, i.e. clauses, can affect significant change in the sector. We want to enable high-profile actors and their supply chains to realise their net zero targets through climate contracting. And we want to promote and support use of those clauses across all built environment actors in the UK, EU, Switzerland, Norway, and beyond. I'll now hand over to Phoebe to explain why we've targeted the built environment sector, in particular for this special pilot project.
Thank you so much, Josh, for such a clear and articulate framing of our very exciting conversation today. So, as I'm sure is no surprise to everyone in the room today, the built environment really is on the front line of the climate crisis. Buildings and infrastructure are the indoor spaces where we go when it's too hot to be outside, and they're the places that need to be flood and storm and wildfire proof. The increasing incidence of heat-related impacts and deaths among construction workers that create these spaces is really quite shocking. And for businesses, management of accelerating and dynamic climate-related risks is now critical to overall effective enterprise risk management. For lawyers, you might be checking existing flood risk modelling as part of your role at the moment, but the past is no analogue for the future when it comes to the climate crisis. You cannot take a precedented approach to unprecedented risks. So for those of us who are working with built assets, we have an amazing opportunity to have a very significant impact on reducing global emissions through net zero project delivery and really accelerating the upgrade of our existing assets to be net zero aligned. We know that almost 40% of global emissions are attributable to the built environment in some way or another. And that is a very significant chunk, which means there's lots of work for us to do in the built environment. So you're likely either working at an organisation or for an organisation as your client who has set a net zero target. I think over 90% of the world's economy is now governed by a net zero target in some respects. But do you have a clear picture of the middle steps that you need to take from target setting to actually hitting those targets? And how do we go about that? And that's really the particular focus of today's session. How do we ensure that our counterparty arrangements and our contracting arrangements are helping and not hindering that transition? So as Josh has so eloquently set out for us, at TCLP, we're providing you with the solution to prepare your organisations and your built assets for the future. So net zero contracting provides you with an opportunity to take these demonstrable steps towards net zero goals. And really, you can use contracts to cascade these net zero targets throughout your counterparty arrangements and your supply chains to ensure that you're maximising your chances of delivering to those targets through incentivisation. And Josh will talk more about our tools and resources in a minute. So as we know, construction and real estate in particular are both highly technical and specialised areas with significant commercial barriers and challenges, which it would be remiss for me to not mention today as a context of our conversation. This includes slim profit margins, risk allocation issues, and supply chain disruptions, to name a few at the moment. And so to get to net zero and beyond, the entire sector needs to come together and to collaborate to drive solutions. And this includes the lawyers. And I'm not just saying that because I am one, but I really can't stress this enough about how important the role is for lawyers to have a seat at the table in facilitating this very necessary transition to net zero. And the transactional lawyers is what I'm specifically referring to here. Because if it's not in the contract, then it's not going to happen. So my final tip is to bring your lawyers in earlier on in the journey and really to bring in and instruct your panel firm, if you're in an organisation, to help you implement these clauses. But before we talk to the lawyers, we are lucky to be joined by one of these collaborative cross-jurisdictional built environment champions who are working to drive sustainability solutions across the built environment. And we are very lucky to have her sit on our Built Environment Advisory Committee. Welcome, Kirsty Draper, to the conversation. As Josh has mentioned, Kirsty is the Head of Sustainability for UK agency JLL, a global real estate service provider with offices in 80 countries. So welcome, Kirsty. And we'll start by asking you to please introduce yourself to everyone on the line and your work with JLL and, of course, your involvement with the Chancery Lane project.
Sure, thanks, Phoebe. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I've actually got a slightly unusual role at JLL. I don't have a sustainability background. I have very much a real estate background. I worked in capital markets for 14 years. I spent 3 years in Hong Kong. I got back from Hong Kong in 2015, and that's when I started to get involved in sustainability. At which point I realised I was actually quite good at translating ESG speak into commercial drivers. And so was getting more and more involved until we went into lockdown, March 2020, and then kind of stopped doing it for a while, at which point the business realised that firstly, it needed someone doing what I had been doing and that it was probably a full-time role. So a year ago, the business created a new role that they asked me to fill, which was embedding sustainability into our agency business line. So I do speak with clients on a really regular basis, but a large part of my role is actually upskilling our agents, so our leasing tenant rep agents, the ones who are actually responsible for setting that initial relationship between the landlord and tenant, getting those objectives aligned and kind of getting those key terms into the heads of terms. So that's my main focus. I have been involved increasingly in more and more kind of industry discussions because it is just such a hot topic at the moment. And yeah, the TCLP involvement is one of those, which is fantastic and really great to be involved with.
Amazing. So, Kirsty, I understand that in your role, particularly when you're talking with clients and also capacity building internally, you've gained exposure across several European property markets. And given that is the sort of where everyone's joining us from today, we'd love to hear your insights on the status and perception of climate conscious contracts across Europe. I know you can't speak for every country across Europe, but just those insights you have.
Sure. I think it's really interesting because different countries are definitely on different places on their journey. You know, the UK, Netherlands is kind of probably pretty far ahead, a couple of steps ahead of, say, Germany, who are in turn perhaps a couple of steps ahead of, say, Poland. And whilst there are some regional nuances, for example, culturally, data sharing is a huge issue that needs to be overcome in Germany. Whereas in Spain, inspection rights seem to be a bit more of an issue. France obviously has the Decret Tertiaire, which has a big influence on the data sharing piece. In the UK, we've got the 1954 Act to contend with. So, you know, there are those differences. But it was interesting, I was speaking at a webinar last week where we had lawyers from various different countries, and when they were asked about what the key challenges were, actually there were two main challenges that came up from every single country, and that was around how biting the clauses are, and then also who pays, how that split incentive is addressed, which is a really knotty topic that a lot of people want to kind of bury their head in the sand with, but actually does need to be addressed. But for me, the really interesting thing from that seminar was when all of the lawyers were asked about how many leases there would be in, say, green leases there would be in like 5 years' time, everyone thought that it would be quite a significant number. And I think it's going to have to be, because actually this is being driven really by investors at the moment who, you know, with SFDR and EU taxonomy alignment, they need to know that they have a legal mechanism in place to actually both measure and then make change.
You picked up a few points there, and I'm only going to be able to pick one, I think, to talk to. The complexity of the issues, and really so much of this, you know, investors and different stakeholders, and particularly around, you know, that how many green leases there are going to need to be, but really it'll just be leases, and all leases will need to be green. On the topic of stakeholders, though, because I understand that is one of the biggest challenges, is really getting that buy-in and getting decision makers on board. So with your experience, at a broad level, who are those key stakeholders that need to be included, in particular in driving the uptake of climate clauses across the built environment?
Everyone. Sorry, no, that was a bit of a flippant answer. But in all seriousness, everyone needs to be on board. Everyone needs to understand the importance of it. And I think it's interesting because obviously we're talking here specifically about the contract itself, or the lease, or the lease as it were. But I think actually there needs to be alignment way before leases even start being negotiated. And then also there needs to be that ongoing alignment afterwards as well. There's so much supporting behaviour, and the reality is all stakeholders do need to be on board with that. And it's not just about, you know, agreeing the clauses, it's about aligning your objectives and working out actually what are you really trying to achieve. And it's interesting, the point you made earlier, Phoebe, around the fact that so many companies have got those corporate objectives, but actually very, very few have got an understanding of what that means for their real estate and how they actually achieve it. And so it's about doing that translation piece, understanding what you're trying to achieve, and then having a lease that supports that. But in order to do that, you do need everyone on board. And I think actually where we see it's most successful is where you have got sustainability reflected at board level, whether it's through that kind of corporate sustainability role. And I think reassuringly, we are increasingly seeing that.
Yeah, okay. It's really, I think, so beneficial for lawyers to hear from people like you, Kirsty, on the commercial side and on the technical side, who are having these conversations and are the ones who are, getting down to the nitty-gritty and also at the very start of the conversation. Just as our final question to you, do you have any top tips for lawyers, and in particular those who are starting out on their journey of climate contracting in the built environment?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of things. I think firstly, it's really important that everyone understands what you're trying to achieve with the lease. And so rather than going straight in with kind of the technical clause drafting, actually take a step back and think, right, what are we trying to achieve here? And to think practically about how to do that, because actually it might not be, the lease might not be the best way to achieve it. There might be other mechanisms to use. And so to think practically about that. But also, I think one of the other key things, and it goes back to that stakeholder piece, is that actually, I think increasingly landlords and tenant relationships have always been slightly adversarial. And actually, to really drive change, that there needs to be a shift in that to a more partnership approach. And so I think actually, if everyone approached these negotiations as okay, we're trying to work together to solve this, rather than kind of a point winning, which often it is in negotiations, but just that slight shift in mindset will go a long way to actually getting these things embedded.
Yeah, and demonstrating those co-benefits of these climate solutions. Thank you so much, Kirsty. That's all we have time for today, but we're so grateful for your insights. And I think everyone on the call understands why we're so lucky to have Kirsty on our advisory committee for the Built Environment Project. So thank you. And back over to you, Josh.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Kirsty. That was fantastic. And thank you, Phoebe. So a good place to start your journey is on our dedicated Built Environment Resources page. A few of you might have seen it already. For anyone with a smartphone to hand, you can view the QR code on screen through your phone camera, and that'll take you straight to our webpage if you'd like to have a look as we're going along today. Otherwise, it can be found in the toolkit section of the TCLP website, and we will, of course, circulate these slides as a follow-up to the session, so you'll have that to hand in future. So to save your legal and your contract team's time and money, hopefully, in drafting new contracts to reduce your emissions, our Built Environment page features more than 30 of our ambitious planning, construction, real estate and supply chain clauses. Our Built Environment podcast series, which are short, accessible conversations with the authors behind 5 of our core Built Environment clauses, hopefully more in future, and they explain how they work and tips for using them in your contracts. We've also got external resources for thinking about the wider sector and key issues like ensuring a just transition and thinking about financing and how that all fits into the picture as well. If you'd like to read the views of industry peers on TCLP, we've included articles by lawyers and companies getting to grips with using the clauses in practice. Recently, we've added some great articles by Groundshaw, Arup, and the Government Construction Playbook, where we're referenced as a recommended resource for contracting authorities procuring sustainable projects. As you can see from this summary slide, which is available to download as a PDF on the webpage and includes web links to each individual clause and relevant podcast episodes. In our clause bank, you can access clauses covering all stages of the built asset lifecycle. That covers financing through to materials and contracted procurement, renewable energy supply and anti-slavery provisions, sustainable on-site working practices, and of course, leasing arrangements between landlords and tenants. We've also got due diligence questionnaires for assessing your contractors, suppliers, emissions management plans for projects, and benchmarking mechanisms to inform your decision-making. Many of the clauses include offset, termination, or cascade mechanisms to incentivize the parties and give your climate commitments some teeth, which speaks to what Kirsty was saying earlier. And it's important to have these in order to motivate the parties to actually hit their targets and not just be talking points. So some of our clauses are designed for use with industry standard form agreements like FIDIC and JCT. And we recently consulted with NEC on their new X29 secondary option clause for carbon reduction in projects, which many of you might have seen in the industry press recently. I'd like to explain at this point that all TCLP clauses have an alternative title alongside their legal formal name. They're named after a child in the life of the lawyers who drafted the clause, because by contracting with the climate in mind, the idea is that we're contracting for the next generation. So that's why you see Thomas's disclosure checklist, Maria's scorecard, Teddy's clause, and so on. The clauses are tangible steps that you can adapt to suit your business and start using right now. They're not just another policy document or long-term target to sign up to, but actually an instant way to show your climate commitments to your stakeholders in black and white. You've got it down there on the page if it's in your contracts. And if it's relevant to you, you can help secure green finance linked to sustainability KPIs by having these down and on paper in order to show to your investors and relevant parties. Clauses are also one way to mitigate becoming a target of future litigation, which, as we've seen recently, is being aimed at an increasingly wide net of built environment companies who could be seen to facilitate carbon-intensive business. There's a lot to take in on a first visit, and this slide might be slightly overwhelming. It can be difficult to know which clauses might be appropriate for your level of climate ambition and the resources available at your company. So let's get to know just a few clauses as examples for you today. So the clauses I'm about to walk you through cover construction, real estate, and some universally applicable wording that can be dropped into any contract. The clauses are stepping stones for your organization, beginning at the bottom with a couple of examples that are easy to integrate into your day-to-day, and progressing upwards to clauses that would require increasing collaboration from suppliers and contractors. So first up at the bottom there, we have our shortest clause, Eddie's recitals. This is a low effort and win-win way to frame a contract and the intentions of the parties in terms that are aligned with achieving net zero and Paris Agreement goals. The clause doesn't impose any binding obligations. Any lawyers in the room familiar with recitals will know what recitals clause is. It sits right at the start of the contract. Eddie's recitals is probably quite easy to implement, and while it isn't likely to have any great effect in reducing emissions, it would be an easy win to add to contracts and at least gets the parties thinking about net zero in performing their obligations. Second step there on the ladder is Robin's questionnaire. And this is one of our most popular construction clauses, perhaps thanks to its low barrier to entry on the part of the employer. The questionnaire allows organizations to set and publish expectations of your contractors or your construction suppliers. And this also helps investors and other stakeholders to understand your stance on climate change. The questionnaire doesn't impose requirements on the parties, but instead it encourages self-reflection on existing sustainability practices. And the idea is to drive gradual improvement over time aligned with your climate ambition. Subcontractors or suppliers are incentivized to do better as their responses are considered in the request for proposal and or qualification process. The central step there on the ladder is Lotta's clause. Now this is a relatively low barrier to entry clause. It's one of my favorites. It delivers emissions reductions for landlords and tenants by ensuring that electricity supplied to a leasehold property is from renewable sources. Lotta's clause is one way to satisfy both environmentally conscious tenants who might want to ensure their power comes from renewable sources, while also benefiting landlords by reducing their carbon footprint, their scope 3 emissions, and progressing their net zero goals. Next step on the ladder is Luna's clause. So Luna's clause allows contractors to propose a variation to the project works, that's in construction works, that's aligned to the employer's net zero targets. We all know that construction methods and specifications for asset energy efficiency are rapidly evolving, and Luna's clause provides a mechanism and an incentive by which projects can adapt. Employers can benefit from reduced long-term energy costs of the development and increased access to green financing. Finally, we have APME's clause. Now, APME's clause allows landlords and tenants to reduce unnecessary waste and purchase of new products by prompting them to follow circular economy principles in repair and alterations. This is prioritizing reused, reclaimed or recycled goods and materials ahead of brand new goods or materials. APME's clause helps to reduce the amount of waste going to landfill and ultimately the built environment's reliance on natural resources. APME's clause is also the start of our first podcast episode, which is available on our website. So beyond the built environment clauses and resources I've just run you through, we've got a wealth of free to use resources that you can point your legal teams to. And these are all designed to assist your organizations with more general drafting for net zero. We've got a fantastic net zero toolkit, which includes explainer documents, shorter and longer videos introducing the concept of net zero, depending on how keen you are, and various tools such as the net zero dashboard, a drafting checklist, and a discussion paper on commerciality in drafting for the climate. And that's all to help your legal teams become fluent with climate concepts. We've got a wonderful glossary with currently 54 climate-related terms, more to be published in the near future. And that's really useful to dip into and upskill on fundamental terms we'll all need to know for the future. Words like offsetting, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and the difference between net zero and carbon neutral, for instance. We also have case studies, and these are examples set by market leaders like TLT, Bates Wells, and the organisations listed here on screen. We've got a fantastic built environment case study from the UK Environment Agency, and I want to just explore this with you now to illustrate how our clauses can work in the real world. So the Environment Agency, that's the UK Environment Agency, Thames Estuary Asset Management Programme, which is a mouthful, or Team 2100 for short, is an integrated delivery team focused on flood risk management. They've used the Chancery Lane project's precedents as an inspiration for their sustainability clauses in contracts. Now, to give you some background, flood management, because of the use of heavy construction materials, accounts for more than 50% of the Environment Agency's carbon footprint, and 75% of that footprint comes from its supply chain. Inspired by circular economy concepts in precedents such as Alex's Clause and APME's Clause, which we just discussed, Team 2100 now requires that its contractors use a certain amount of certified sustainable materials, such as cradle-to-cradle certification, and they also must deliver against wider sustainability objectives, including carbon reduction overall. The agency have told us that most of the drafting for their clauses came from our bank of precedent clauses, and that these provided the agency with mechanisms for measuring carbon, the various types of emissions, and a variety of glossary definitions they used in their contracts. After drafting the clause, the agency conducted a supplier day to engage with their suppliers on the framework that they wanted to use, and all suppliers reacted positively to the day and to the initiative overall. Agency lawyers have told us that the TCLP clauses give them a glimpse of what can be achieved in future through contracting, and this makes them very positive about the future prospect of driving down emissions through sensible and considerate buying decisions. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Humzah, who's very kindly going to introduce TCLP's Transpositions project and how our teams are rolling out the project across Europe. So over to you, Humzah.
Thank you very much, Josh. Good morning, everyone. My name is Humzah. I'm a project associate at the Chancery Lane project and also lead on our Transpositions project. It's great to be here in the company of such great speakers and also to see so many of you in the room. On the back of what Phoebe and Josh have been talking about in the first part of this session in terms of introducing you to TCLP and our built environment clauses, I'm here to talk to you about our new and innovative Transpositions project, which involves adapting climate clauses for your jurisdiction. So we launched our Transpositions project towards the end of May of this year. And for TCLP, transposition means the process of making TCLP clauses relevant and usable in new contexts. The backdrop to this is that if we are to realise a world in which every contract enables solutions to climate change, climate contracting must be normalised across every jurisdiction and sector around the world. So historically, TCLP and our clauses have had very much of an England and Wales focus, but now climate contracting has become a proven concept. We've decided to go global, which is epitomised by this European stakeholder event today. So just briefly in terms of what context clauses are transposed into, the first and main transposition type is a jurisdictional transposition, which essentially means transposing a climate clause that was initially drafted for England and Wales into your local law. However, we do have other transpositions types as well. We have a sector transposition, which involves adapting a TCLP clause from one sector to another. And thirdly, a transposition that increases the level of climate ambition from when it was initially drafted to have low climate ambition into much higher climate ambition. But with that being said, the main focus so far has been transpositions into new jurisdictions. So since we launched the project, it has grown exponentially, and I'm delighted to say that we now have transpositions teams in the USA, Australia, New Zealand, India, Ireland, Mexico, Canada, Germany, and the Cayman Islands, with lots of expression of interest in other jurisdictions too, which has been really great to see. So if you're sitting in a new jurisdiction that already has a transitions team or is feeling inspired about starting a new one now that you've heard a bit more about it, why should you consider transposing TCLP clauses? First of all, it's an incredible opportunity to meet and collaborate with like-minded lawyers in your jurisdiction. By contributing to the drafting or the peer review of clauses, which we'll touch on in just a moment, this project allows you to apply your legal expertise and the unique knowledge you have to commercial drafting that will ultimately result in carbon reductions. As we know, climate change is no longer a problem of the future, so having skills and experience in climate conscious drafting will be massively beneficial to both your organization and your clients. So as a now problem that requires climate aligned provisions across your contracts to not only mitigate climate risks, but also maximize climate opportunities, the simple fact is that the use of climate clauses will be central to your role as a lawyer. So your participation in this project ensures that you and your colleagues are able to access and use these clauses in your contracts as soon as possible. And finally, your participation in this project allows you to use your agency to have a real and meaningful impact. By drafting, promoting, and using our clauses in your jurisdiction, you can help TCLP to accelerate and scale its impact around the world so that every contract can tackle the climate crisis. Can we have the next slide, please, Josh? That's brilliant. Thank you very much. So this slide just outlines our transpositions process. So if you are creating a new transpositions team, the first stage is to convene team members to meet each other and establish some next steps, usually across different transpositions teams. And because collaboration is such a central part of the TCLP process, it usually involves bringing together lawyers and industry professionals from a whole host of different organizations. So before you actually select the TCLP clauses that you're going to transpose, we say that you need to think strategically about which clauses you decide to transpose. And these are generally the clauses that will not only remove the most carbon, but are also most likely to be used in your jurisdiction. So what we don't do is ask teams to transpose all 119 of TCLP's climate clauses, but rather a handful that are the most relevant and will deliver the most impact. This impact assessment can be done in many different ways. However, we do recommend that teams complete a carbon needs analysis for the jurisdiction, which provides a very high-level overview of the priority sectors for decarbonisation and the best intervention points for climate-aligned contractual provisions. However, with that being said, your clause selection may also be informed by new legislation in your jurisdiction, for example, new market trends, or even what clients are demanding from you across the board. The next stage is the actual drafting of the clauses and then having them peer reviewed. Here, you will need to engage sector-specific legal experts for both elements. A rigorous peer review process is an essential part of the TCLP process. We ensure the quality and the credibility of our clauses by involving sector-specific as well as environmental lawyers at this stage. And once your clauses have been drafted and reviewed, you can then submit it to TCLP, where we will host it on our website. The next stage, and arguably the most important stage of the process, is to take responsibility for not only periodically updating the clauses so that they remain relevant in your jurisdiction, but also promoting its use across your contracts. All of this information is included in our Transpositions information pack, which I will link in the chat in just a moment. And if this does sound of interest to you, I will also link an expression of interest form where you can tell us about which jurisdiction you like to be involved with and your preferred contribution to the project, whether it's the actual drafting of the clauses or perhaps the peer review of the content once it has been drafted. So thanks very much for listening. I'm now going to hand back to Josh, who is going to introduce you to members of the Irish Transpositions team, who will speak to their experience of the process from a more practical perspective. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thanks, Humzah. That was a great introduction to transpositions. I hope that some of you in the audience today are inspired to join or start your local team to have an impact in your jurisdiction. And speaking of making an impact in your local jurisdiction, we're now going to hear from a fantastic transpositions project. Welcome, Derval and Sinead. It's lovely to have you here, and thanks for joining us. As you know, we're really impressed with your work, and we're very keen to share it with everyone here today. So Derval, if I could perhaps start with you, it'd be fantastic if you could please introduce yourself and tell us about what you've achieved with the Irish Property Working Group and how you went about it.
Thank you, Josh, and thanks to the Chancery Lane project for inviting myself and Sinead to speak about our experience. So just to introduce myself, I'm a real estate professional support lawyer in Arthur Cox. So I'm responsible for the real estate group's knowledge and training. So that includes maintaining precedent real estate documents and contracts and leases, of course, and then also delivering training on them. So the development of climate conscious drafting is something that falls squarely within my remit within the real estate group and more widely across the firm as well, because there are obviously similar projects going on in other practice groups. I've been in the role for over 5 years now, having previously worked as a real estate associate for a number of years before becoming PSL. So that's me. And actually just wanted to mention some of the points that Kirsty touched on were really, really interesting. And I think in the lessons learned that Sinead will be discussing in a few moments, she'll be touching on some of the points, some of the challenges I think that Kirsty has highlighted, including how biting the green lease clauses are and costs. Those are 2 points that we did come across as issues in our drafting as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dave. That's fantastic. Sinead, if I could come to you next, if you could start by introducing yourself and tell us what, as Draper said, perhaps lessons learned, advice you might share with your counterparts in Ireland or other European countries who could be looking to adapt TCLP clauses for their own work as well.
Thanks, Josh, and also delighted to be here today, and thanks for inviting us along.
Great.
I am the Director of Knowledge at Mason Hayes & Curran. I support the real estate department. So again, like Dervla, climate conscious drafting is very much within my remit. And prior to becoming a knowledge lawyer in MHC, I was on the real estate transactional side. So I have been there at the cold face of negotiating leases. In terms of the advice I would give to counterparts in transposing, using, adapting TCLP clauses, etc., the first, I suppose, piece of advice I would have is to look at the clauses, and in terms of Irishizing, that's what we had to do, the clauses, putting a shamrock on them, look at the concepts and definitions. For example, changing EPC to BER, but it wasn't just that. We obviously had to take into account the nuances of the Irish market, regulation of landlord and tenant law here, and we had to try and strike a balance so that the clauses weren't too heavily weighted in favour of either landlords or tenants. I suppose also consider future-proofing leases, which can be difficult to do, but try and do it as much as possible, in that regulation and developments in the area, as you know, are coming so thick and fast and will continue to do so. And indeed, technological advancements are occurring at such a pace. And whilst we have rainwater harvesting and solar panels now, for example, who knows what technology might exist in 10, 15, 20 years' time during the lifetime of a lease, or what new regulations might apply. And one thing, I suppose, when we started out this journey, the Irish TCLP group last year, we went all gung-ho at the very outset and decided we were going to draft a full suite of lease clauses, which is great. It's resulted in a great body of work, over 20 clauses, but it has taken us longer to get there. And it may have been more efficient to really break down the clauses into individual provisions or group related clauses together, for example, alterations, repair clauses, etc. So as Dervla will mention in when she talks about how we went about drafting the clauses, we are going to release the clauses in a few separate releases just to make sure that they're a little bit more easily digestible. And as Kirsty mentioned, actually, in relation to the legally binding nature of clauses, that is something that we did grapple with at the beginning, because I suppose the most common approach at the moment is quite aspirational and not necessarily strictly binding. But we decided at the outset that we were going to make them legally binding. We wanted them to have teeth. So as a result, we have developed a suite of green dispute mechanisms, which will involve a stepped process ranging from landlords and tenants mutually agreeing a remedial plan right up to a landlord being entitled to forfeit the lease for a breach of green clauses. So I suppose one learning from that is to get potentially dispute resolution lawyers involved at an early stage. Also, if environmental experts are going to be appointed to adjudicate on disputes, you may need to consult with the relevant professional body. So do that as soon as possible. And speaking of external experts and other stakeholders, one learning we would have from drafting the clauses is the need for early engagement with other experts and stakeholders. And we were obviously very focused on the nitty-gritty lease aspects, but input of those external stakeholders is really key, and from other colleagues with expertise relevant to the clauses. So get that as early as possible. Dervla will kind of speak around the feedback we've received, but we received excellent feedback from sustainability consultant, property agents and valuers, etc. And these were key to actually preparing the clauses, so get that early on. And the input from agents, as I mentioned, was key. One of the important aspects to consider in drafting the green lease provisions, or indeed incorporating them into your leases, is the potential impact of such provisions on rent review and or value. As lawyers, obviously, we're not qualified to advise on this, so the input from professional valuers is key. And then also input from technical advisors. For example, as I mentioned, the sustainability consultant or environmental consultants on practical operational issues and the potential costs involved in any clauses, which obviously can be a knotty issue, as Kirsty mentioned, between landlords and tenants. So there are some of our key learnings that we thought we might be helpful to share. Dervla will talk us through, I suppose, how we went about the actual drafting of the clauses.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sinead. That's really valuable to hear those lessons. And I'll pass back to you, Dervla, to sort of elaborate on how you went about it. That'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So in terms of, what we produced and how we went about it, I suppose before I get into how we went about it, just to tell you, I suppose, what the end product of that process was or is, we have produced a menu or a suite of green lease clauses for use in Irish commercial leases, and they're intended primarily for leases of new multi-let office buildings. So those types of buildings that have a service charge regime where the tenants contribute to the cost of repairing and maintaining the common areas. So it's not that we've produced a standalone green lease as such, it's more of a menu of clauses that parties can pick and choose from. So they go from light green to dark green. So from the more aspirational cooperation clauses, whereby parties agree to, share information and maybe to set up a forum to discuss ways to improve the environmental performance of the building. Then we go to the more darker clauses, darker green clauses that impose more significant green obligations on the parties. And of course, it will be transaction dependent as to what clauses are included in the lease. There's always going to be commercial negotiation between the parties as to which clauses will be incorporated. But I suppose there are a few factors that need to be taken into account. So the nature of the premises, whether it's a single let building with one tenant or a multi-let building with numerous tenants, the age of the building, of course, will be relevant, and the parties' appetite for sustainability measures and their respective bargaining strength. They're all in the mix. So that's just, I suppose, a summary of what we have produced and kind of the factors we think that are relevant to deciding which clauses might be used. But in terms of then how the group came together, what happened was in early 2021, the Chancery Lane project contacted the Arthur Cox pro bono associate, Caroline Minnock, to inquire about establishing climate conscious drafting groups across a number of our practice areas in Arthur Cox. And then happily around the same time, the Irish Law Society's Landlord and Tenant Task Force also expressed an interest in developing guidance on green leases for Irish lawyers. So in the spirit of collaboration, we decided to pool our resources and work together under the umbrella of the Chancery Lane project. And the group currently comprises about 20 lawyers from across a number of Irish law firms, ranging from newly qualified right up to, more senior lawyers. So it's great to have that mix. But we've had numerous inquiries from other lawyers and other law firms and other PSLs about joining the group. So it looks like the group is going to grow, which is very encouraging. Then to produce our clauses, what we did in terms of sourcing our clauses, of course, the first source that we used was the Chancery Lane project clauses themselves. So the clauses that Humzah pointed out there in terms of the lease clauses, Ashmay's, Rosie's clause, they were obviously very useful for us in terms of taking those clauses, transposing them for Irish leases and, adapting them so that they fit into Irish leases. But not only did we look at the Chancery Lane project, we looked at other sources as well, including the UK Better Buildings partnership, or Building Better partnership. Their green lease toolkit was very useful. And we also looked at some Australian green lease clauses. And of course, then the firms themselves, everybody contributed their own precedent clauses. And it was great actually that, you know, everybody was so willing to share any templates that they had, because again, in the spirit of collaboration, you know, we all wanted to pool our resources and produce, I suppose, the best product that we could in the end. And just to say also, for people who are looking at getting involved in this type of exercise, the Chancery Lane projects clauses are really invaluable because they give you a really good framework to work from, and they give you really, really good background information and definitions. So you'll have seen the, you know, the glossary and the net zero toolkit that were pointed out earlier. Those are really invaluable tools in terms of kind of getting the background information and kind of understanding the framework within which you're drafting. And also just to mention that for us, and for this group, we had to kind of take a step back and look at green leases in a more global sense. You know, without going headlong into the drafting, which I think has been mentioned previously as well, you know, we just felt that we needed to take a step back and get a better understanding of the concepts involved and the terminology. So things like net zero, you know, what does the Paris Agreement say? What is embodied carbon? What's carbon offsetting? So getting a better understanding of those concepts was key, as well as reviewing the regulatory background and looking at green building certifications in a bit more detail and getting a better understanding of what's certified by those building ratings. And as Sinead mentioned, we did have some non-legal experts help us with that, including sustainability consultants who kind of helped us get a better understanding of those building ratings. So basically then what we ended up with was a bank of new clauses, and some of them are quite innovative, but the whole focus obviously is designed to promote the improved environmental performance of buildings and, you know, help us get to net zero. Then sorry, Josh, yeah.
That's okay. So I was going to say, amazing. Thank you. I'm really inspired by this collaboration across firms, and that's really what TCLP is all about. Just conscious we've got about 5 minutes left of the session. I've got one final question for you. I'd love to ask if I could possibly answer it in sort of 30 seconds or a minute, and for both of you, if you would like to answer. So what, in your experience, is the current status of green clauses in the market in your jurisdiction, and if you have an experience of it across Europe as well?
Thanks, Josh. What I would say is that currently the most common approach in Ireland to green lease provisions is aspirational, encouraging cooperation, collaboration, and information sharing between landlords and tenants, rather than being hugely onerous and strictly legally binding. However, I think we are now starting to see leases with more onerous and innovative green clauses. For example, rent abatements for tenants if landlords fail to secure a certain standard of certification for a building. And as Dermot mentioned, like, the suite of clauses we're putting together is ambitious. That's the spirit of TCLP. There are some innovative clauses that practitioners, clients, and industry professionals may not have seen before or may not be overly familiar with. One example would be a tenant's right to carry out works to improve environmental performance. But what I would say is that with an increased focus on ESG in the Irish market and internationally, we can only assume that it's going to go one way, and that we will see more and more green clauses and leases, and indeed more onerous green lease provisions. And real estate certainly has a role to play in our clients' ESG policies and that of investors and lenders. And at MHC, we're helping to steer our clients through the ever-changing and complex issues they face. And that's why it's great to be involved in TCLP and to play a first-hand role in developing the clauses for use in the Irish market.
Amazing. Wonderful. Thank you, Sinead. Thank you, Dave. That was really, really valuable to hear your insights there. I'm sure everyone in the audience appreciates it. And we're very proud of your work as well. Looking forward to seeing it published soon.
Yeah, and hopefully, actually, I was just going to mention that, Josh, that we're hoping to publish the first release. So we're going to publish in a set of 4 releases and publish hopefully the first release along with the drafting outline for that before the end of October. And also, if I may, just also mention that the Irish Working Group is co-led by myself, Sinead, and Judith Cryan in Byrne-Wallace, who is also a real estate PSL. So Judith isn't speaking today, but I just wanted to give her a shout out because obviously she's been central to the work of the working group also.
Of course. Thank you, Judith, and thank you, Caroline, as well, and everyone that's been involved with the group. I'll pass back to Phoebe for a very quick wrap up for the session today.
Thank you so much. I always find it so inspiring to hear from the Irish Property Working Group. So I won't take up too much more of your time this morning, but I just wanted to quickly wrap up with the next steps you can take and ways of getting involved with the project, and also to flag some of the next steps that we have coming up with the project as well, and the built environment project in particular. So of course, the biggest impact that you can have is to start using our clauses, but in the interim, you can sign up to our newsletter and receive our fortnightly updates of new clauses, content and events, and look out for our pro bono opportunities board for the latest opportunities to get involved with the project. Of course, please tell your legal teams and contract managers about the project, and you could ask them to review our free resources. We also have guidance. They can attend our workshops, view our pre-recorded learning sessions and clinics. And of course, you can heed Humzah's advice and join one of our Transpositions team. But also, most importantly, as I've mentioned, is to use our clauses, and then really what can help spread the good word is to provide us with a case study with how you've been using those clauses to demonstrate leadership in this space. So as I mentioned, I wanted to talk a little bit about what's next, because we acknowledge that net zero is really only the beginning of the story, and that we really can't address the climate change without considering the broader impacts of the climate crisis, including just transition issues. So we will be hosting an event in coming months to explore this really critical issue in the sector and what this means for our clauses and the updates that will be required to our clauses to ensure that they are considering social and just transition issues. This will be alongside some updated TCLP guidance on just transitions, which will soon be launched. And if you'd like to dive into just transition in the meantime, the Institute for Human Rights and Business have some fantastic free online resources, including their framework for dignity in the built environment, which is linked on our built environment webpage. We also have a new contract map that is currently being produced by law firm TLT to develop an interactive tool that aims to map the built environment contract ecosystem and plot TCLP's clauses on that map. And this will help stakeholders to use the clauses in the context of the wider built asset lifecycle, and to identify gaps of where they can use clauses to really as levers to drive climate action. And the final next step for us is that we'll be updating the clause guidance that sits behind every clause that we have on the TCLP website. In particular, those potential barriers for use and suggested solutions to overcome these, which I'm sure you've heard a lot of today on the call. Those consistent themes that we've seen around collaborating, getting involved early, and really the sector coming together with these solutions. So just on the last slide that we have here, we want to acknowledge and just say that providing the clauses is really only a fraction of the work that needs to be done, and getting them into contracts is difficult for a whole host of reasons. So all of our events are available to book through our website, and it would be incredible to see you at them in the future, and really to see you talking about how you're using clauses or attending our events with your colleagues between now and then. So Josh will just pop a feedback survey in the chat now, and we'd love to hear from you about how we can improve for future events. So that is it from us, and thank you very much for listening and coming along today. And of course, a very special thank you to Dries, Sinead, Kirsty and Humzah for joining us today. And that is it from the Built Environment team at the Chancery Lane project.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks,
all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kirsty. Thanks.